Welcome to 5 Decades, One Mission, a series of 6 episodes celebrating the golden anniversary of 2 key 1975 events that gave rise to the U.S. animal rights movement. The first event was the publication of Animal Liberation by Australian philosopher Peter Singer, which introduced the concept of animal rights to American audiences. The other was the World Vegetarian Congress that provided the troops for the U.S. animal rights movement and would develop in the years that followed.
My name is Alex Hershaft. I launched the Vegetarian Information Service in 1976 and the Farm Animal Rights Movement and the Animal Rights National Conference in 1981. I am the coordinator of this project. My partners are Eric Lindstrom, Executive Director of Farm, and Jeff Adams, producer of the Vegan Linked channel on YouTube. In this episode 1, I explain why 1975 was the watershed year in launching the U.S. animal rights movement. The presenters then introduce themselves in more detail. The 5 episodes that follow deal with different aspects of the birth, early years, and accomplishments of our movement. Episode 2 deals with animal liberation and the Vegetarian Congress. Episode 3 addresses our early campaigns. Episode 4 is about rallying our movement. Episode 5 is celebrating our lost pioneers. And Episode 6 goes into our progress and prospects.
I'm Eric Lindstrom, Executive Director of Farm Animal Rights Movement. Several historical factors made 1975 the watershed year. There was practically no animal rights and very little vegetarian activity in the U.S. before 1975. On the other hand, the 1975 World Vegetarian Congress spurred the formation of 60 local vegetarian societies and publication of a dozen books. The publication of Animal Liberation motivated animal rights activists who then inspired the vegetarian community to adopt the animal rights concept. To be clear, a number of national animal protection organizations were already in place in 1975. The American Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the American Humane Association, and the major anti-vivisection organizations that hark back to the 19th century. Animal Welfare Institute was formed in 1951. In 1954, the Humane Society of the U.S. was founded. Friends of Animal in 1957. 10 years later, the Fund for Animals was founded. And finally, Animal Protection Institute in 1968. However, none of these organizations advocated for the right of animals to live free from human oppression, the key principle of today's animal rights movement. None showed any interest in farmed animals, except on their dinner plate. None involved the advocacy programs, grassroots activities, or national conferences generally associated with the national movement. The only vegetarian organization before 1975 were located in a half-dozen major cities, and those associated with the Seventh-day Adventist Church. As mentioned, the 1975 World Vegetarian Congress led to the formation of 60 local organizations and publication of a dozen books. During the 5 years that followed, the vegetarians had the numbers, the local organizations, the books, and the culture of not eating animals. However, by the end of that period, their activism had waned and consisted mainly of potlucks and picnics. During the same period, Animal Liberation energized a dozen key activists like Henry Spira, Alex Pacheco, Ingrid Newkirk, Richard Morgan, Doug Moss, Connie Salamone, Nellie Shriver, George Cave, Dana Stuchel, Michael and Karen Budke, and Jim Mason, among others, who were filled with the idealism and enthusiasm to conduct dramatic animal liberation campaigns. When the two groups got together at the 1981 Action for Life conference in Allentown, Pennsylvania, the animal rights contingency took over. The vegetarians gave up their ice cream and cheese and became the troops of the new animal rights movement. That conference became the physical birthplace of the U.S. animal rights movement.
I'm Peter Singer. I've been for many years a professor of philosophy and of bioethics, and I'm the author of Animal Liberation. I was a graduate student in philosophy at the University of Oxford in 1969. I went there and I had never thought about animal rights. In fact, the whole concept of animal rights I'd never heard of, and I hadn't really been interested in ethics about animals, but I was working in ethics. And in 1970, I happened to meet another graduate student, a Canadian called Richard Keshen, and when we had lunch for the first time, he asked whether there was meat in the sauce on the spaghetti that was being served. when he was told, yes, there is, he asked for a salad plate, which had no meat on it. And so I asked him at that point, what was his problem with meat? Because this is 1970. You basically didn't really meet vegetarians at all, unless perhaps you were in India or the Hindus. You knew they would be vegetarians. But for somebody from a Western society with essentially a similar background and orientation to me to be a vegetarian, I just hadn't met anyone like that at that point. And his answer to my question was a very simple one. He said, I don't think it's right to treat animals the way in which they're being treated. And I said, well, why not? Aren't they having good lives out in the fields? Of course, I know that they then get trucked to slaughter. That can't be good. But I thought their lives on the whole were good. But he said, no, a lot of these animals are indoors now. They're very crowded. They're very confined. And the whole point of the way they're kept is to produce their meat or milk or eggs as cheaply as possible, with no real thought for animal welfare, as long as the animals continue to be productive in the commercial sense. So that was really my first encounter with the issue of how we treat animals, and it got me thinking, well, what is the moral status of animals? What do we owe them? And also, how are we treating them? So I wanted to investigate a little bit more about how we do treat them. And Richard recommended a book, which I brought here. It was the only book written about factory farming and the way animals were treated at that time, Animal Machines, by Ruth Harrison. Unfortunately, Ruth is no longer alive, but this book had a big impact on me because it documents very clearly the way in which farmers are thinking about confining their animals to maximize profit. And that's not Ruth Harrison's personal opinion. She's quoting from the farming magazines which give advice on how to do that. And that's one of the major reasons why I decided to follow Richard's example and stop eating meat myself.
My general background is that I grew up as a vegetarian. My parents became vegetarian before I was born. They were in the peace movement and had been influenced by people that they knew there, so they knew it was quite possible to do. They had never liked eating meat. As children, they avoided it. My sister and I were raised as vegetarians. And I grew up in England, outside of London, a place called Epsom. My parents were activists in the peace movement and with animal welfare. And so that's how my activism developed. We started an Animals Friends group in our neighborhood with the children. This was when I was about 12, and we would do things such as take neighborhood dogs for walks and feed cats when the owners were away. And we'd look after animals such as birds and tortoises when the neighborhood needed someone to care for them. My organizational skills developed with the campaign for nuclear disarmament, local activities that we did, as well as my participating on marches across the north of England and from Aldermaston to London.
I am a Holocaust survivor who immigrated to America in 1951, earned a PhD in chemistry, and ended up working for a Washington consulting firm in hazardous waste management. In 1972, during a wastewater inventory assignment at a Midwestern slaughterhouse, I came across piles of heads, legs, and other discarded animal body parts. They brought back flashbacks of human hair, glasses, and shoes I saw during my visit to the Auschwitz Museum. They conveyed the nightmarish notion that we may be doing to animals what the Nazis did to us, and the dreadful realization that I had turned from victim of the Holocaust to an oppressor of animals by subsidizing their abuse and slaughter. I pledged to devote the rest of my life to fighting all oppression, beginning with the oppression of animals for food. After attending the 1975 World Vegetarian Congress in Orono, Maine, I was able to realize my pledge by launching the Vegetarian Information Service. By 1981, I embraced veganism and animal rights, then brought animal rights and vegetarian activists together for the first time at the 1981 Action for Life conference in Allentown, Pennsylvania. That became the birthplace of the U.S. animal rights movement. At the same time, I launched Farm Animal Rights Movement, or FARM, and spent the rest 4 decades arranging international farmed animal liberation campaigns and rallying our movement through the annual animal rights national conferences.
I'm Victoria Moran. I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri in the 1950s and 60s. I first heard of vegetarians from my grandmother-aged nanny, who was part of the Unity movement. Unity is a progressive Christian organization founded in the 1890s by ethical vegetarians who actually printed their Bibles with faux leather. It was a fascinating concept and finally came to fruition for me in my late teens. I loved animals and wanted to be vegetarian for them. I was also introduced to yoga, and the 3 books that I found said that if you wanted to do yoga, you needed to stop eating animals. And finally, a couple years later, I was introduced to the American Vegan Society. I loved the vegan concept, but it just seemed terribly, terribly difficult at the time. So I went vegan at home, but it was years before I would become a full-fledged vegan. And thank goodness, Jay and Freya Dinshaw of the American Vegan Society never gave up on me. After being in this work for a while, I was writing in this world. I had already been writing for publication starting at 14. I wrote for teen magazines and met most of the rock groups of the era, including the Beatles. But after going vegetarian, the writing switched to vegetarian and natural health publications. And in the mid-'80s and early '90s, I wrote 3 books: Compassion, the Ultimate Ethic, The Love-Powered Diet, and Get the Fat Out, all about this lifestyle. And then I moved more to books about spirituality and contemporary culture, notably Creating a Charmed Life. That was 1999. It sold 250,000 copies North American and foreign rights to 32 countries. So being a writer has been very good to me. And in 2012, I wrote a book called Main Street Vegan, getting back to my vegan roots as a writer. I'd never left as a human. And Main Street Vegan has really been the basis for everything that I've done since. The Main Street Vegan podcast, Main Street Vegan Academy, training vegan lifestyle coaches and educators, and Main Street Vegan Productions. In 2019, we were the lead producing team for Thomas Jackson's beautiful documentary about food choices and spirituality, A Prayer for Compassion. And now we're in development with a feature film, Miss Liberty, about a cow who escapes from a slaughterhouse.
My name is Jim Mason. I became a vegetarian in 1975. And I've been vegan and vegetarian ever since. I finally recognized the importance of animals at that time, and I became active in a movement about the same time. Then I began to write a couple of books about animal agriculture, which I call animal slavery. In fact, it is slavery. I was a lawyer in Connecticut, but childhood was spent on a family farm in rural Missouri in the 40s and 50s. So I had a lot of firsthand experience with animal agriculture. And at the time, I didn't realize it was wrong. I was told it was necessary. And then as I got older and I got involved in animal movement in the 70s and became a vegetarian and met Peter Singer, and we wrote a book together about animal factories, I woke up to the fact that all of what I'd been told was a lie, and it was animal slavery is absolutely unnecessary in this age that we live in. So that's why I became an activist, and my form of activism is research and writing books and articles about doing things to animals that we think are for our benefit and turned out they're to our detriment. Not good for us, not good for animals. That's my activism. And a friend of mine had a car with a bumper sticker that said, "Warning, I brake for animals." And somehow that intrigued me. A light bulb went on. I wanted to look into this further. So I noted the address of the group. It was Friends of Animals, and they were in New York City. So one day I was in New York City with apropos nothing to do. I thought, I think I'll drop in and check them out. And I did. And I met the president, namely Alice Harrington, who's passed and no longer with us. And I told her I was a lawyer in suburban Connecticut and that I would be willing to do volunteer work. So months went by, and she called me one day and she said, "I got a job for you." And I came in and talked to her, and she gave me an assignment to do some research and some writing. And that established a pattern of me working for her part-time, practicing law part-time, working for Friends of Animals part-time. One of the projects that she put me on was factory farming. She says, "We need to do something about factory farming," which was unknown in America. And this is in 1973, 74. So I wrote a pamphlet for Friends of Animals. It was entitled Factory Farming. And of course, it was a house publication. It didn't get a lot of circulation, a lot of public exposure, but it got me involved in finding out the details about factory farming and learning rhetoric and the language of the industry. So I got some knowledge about factory farming from that little project. And then about the same time, oddly enough, Peter Singer appears on the scene, writing this essay that's now become famous, Animal Liberation. It was for the New Yorker Review of Books, a prominent publication in New York at the time. Alice Harrington, my mentor, saw this and she said, "We got to meet this guy." And I think that's an exact quote. Alice chain-smoked Pall Mall cigarettes and drank straight gin, and she was kind of a tough old woman and kind of vulgar and wonderful and brilliant. So she said, "We got to meet this guy," because we knew he was in New York at the time. So she arranged a meeting, and Peter and I talked about factory farming. My brochure or pamphlet or whatever you call it had just been published, and he was hard at work on what became Animal Liberation, the book. So that's when he asked me to help him find some factory farms. So he and I became friends and associates at the time, both of us working on factory farming. Animal Liberation was published in 1975, and he went back to Australia.
Paul Shapiro. I do a few things. I'm the CEO of the Better Meat Co. I'm the author of a book called Clean Meat, How Growing Meat Without Animals Will Revolutionize Dinner and the World. And I also host a podcast called the Business for Good podcast. I became vegan in 1993, so more than 3 decades ago. I remember when I became vegan, there was a lot of concern, especially from my parents, about the health consequences. They weren't really aware of any health benefits, but they certainly thought there'd be health consequences. And I didn't know what this thing was. I just knew that I wanted to do this because I liked animals and didn't want to hurt them. And I had only read about it in literature, so I told them I wanted to become vegan. And they were like, "What's vegan?" And I tried to explain it to them. And then I started meeting people who I learned weren't vegans, but were vegans. And I was like looking at them and trying to determine, did they look pale? Were they strong? I wanted to kind of poke them, see how they felt. Like, were they real? How long had they been doing it? Because I had been told that this was kind of like holding your breath. You can hold your breath for a certain amount of time, but you do it for too long and you die. And I thought, well, is this thing safe to do, right? If I'm going to become one of these vegans, is that something that I can safely do? And so my parents wanted me to go see a nutritionist. So they pulled out the Yellow Pages. For those of you who are too young to know, the Yellow Pages are like Google before Google existed. They brought me to a nutritionist in Rockville, Maryland, who, by the sheerest of coincidences, happened to herself be vegan. When we got in there and my parents said, "Well, we have this young teenager who wants to be vegan," and she said, "Oh, I'm vegan too." And it was just a shock to them. And so they learned that actually you can do it. So that was the beginning of the journey for me. But the reason that I did it wasn't because I was concerned about health. The reason I did it was because I wanted to help animals. I had seen a video of what happens to animals inside of slaughterhouses and factory farms and other places where animals are exploited. And I just kept thinking to myself, what would I do if those were my dogs? If they were my dogs who were being hung upside down and having their throats cut, if they were my dogs in cages so small they couldn't even turn around for their entire lives, what would I do? And I knew the answer was that I would be willing to do almost anything to prevent that. And so I was forced into an uncomfortable situation where at first I was thinking, how could these bad people be doing this to animals? But pretty quickly I realized, as I was pointing my finger outwards, I had three pointing right back at myself, thinking, what am I doing to support this? Why would, people don't work at slaughterhouses because it's a dream career. They do it because there's money in it, because we pay them to do it. And as much as my 13-year-old mind could comprehend supply and demand, I thought, I don't want to do this. I don't want to be a part of it. And so I became a vegetarian and pretty quickly thereafter a vegan. And I started volunteering at the animal protection groups in Maryland, where I was living at the time when I was in high school. There wasn't any animal protection club in my own high school, and so I thought I would just start one, and I called it Compassion Over Killing. And eventually I wanted to make it into not just a high school club, but a grassroots organization across the entire DC metropolitan area. And so Compassion Over Killing spread out throughout the DC area at first, and then eventually we became a nationwide organization that had offices on both coasts and employees. But the goal was to shine a bright spotlight on what was happening to animals. And our theory of change at the time was, if we could only raise more awareness, if we could only show people what was happening to animals, then some subset of people would decide they too did not want to participate in this type of violence and exploitation of all of these animals. And so we would do all types of undercover investigations at slaughterhouses and livestock auctions and factory farms. We had a large van that we drove around Washington, D.C., where we showed in a theater format what it looked like to be an animal in one of these facilities. And we passed out a lot of booklets. And sadly, as we were doing all of this and generating quite a lot of attention, meat demand just kept going up. Right? We were raising awareness, and at the same time, as awareness was increasing, meat demand was also increasing. Not just increasing in the United States, but increasing more importantly in places like China, India, Brazil, Mexico, all the places where it's going to matter the most in the future. Meat demand just kept going up and up and up. And so eventually I came to the conclusion that rather than merely raising awareness and informing people about the facts of the animal abuse that is so rampant in our food production system, I thought we need to start passing laws and start criminalizing the worst abuses of animals who are raised for food. Because poll after poll after poll shows that most people have grave discomfort with how animals are routinely mistreated. Most people don't support gestation crate confinement of pigs or battery cage confinement of egg-laying chickens and so on. And so we started a campaign to go state by state and pass laws criminalizing some of the worst forms of animal abuse in the factory farming system. And it worked. In red states like Arizona, blue states like California, swing states like Florida, over and over and over again, by double-digit margins, voters, whether they were vegetarian, meat lovers, or vegan, wanted to ban the worst practices. And so as we continued passing more and more state laws, both to prohibit these practices and to prohibit the sale of products that come from these practices, we were really making headway.
My name is Dr. Alka Chanda, and I serve as Vice President of Laboratory Oversight and Special Cases at PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, and I've been there for 22 years. I was an undergraduate in university when I came across the animal rights movement. This was in the early 1980s. I was a progressive student on campus. I was involved in various human rights issues, nuclear disarmament, feminism, that sort of thing. And as part of that, I wrote for our student paper. This was in Canada, and all of the Canadian student papers belonged to a consortium called Canadian University Press. And when one paper didn't have enough articles to fill its pages, it would snap up articles from other papers. So one such article that was snapped up was on animal experimentation. I was 19 years old at the time. I had a pretty big chip on my shoulder thinking, I know what's going on in the world. I read the alternative press. I'm really aware of what happens in other countries. But here, reading this article about animal experimentation, learning that animals were used in painful and deadly experiments to test cosmetics or in curiosity-driven experiments at universities like my own, was a huge shock to me. I was really taken aback by the fact that I didn't know that any of these issues existed. The shock of knowing that we treat animals in this way shook me to my core and made me think about what it meant, what our relationship as human beings was with the other species with whom we share the planet. So about a month later, I was sitting with the editor of the student paper, who was a friend of mine, and I said, you know, Kevin, somebody really needs to write another article about that animal issue. It seems important to me. And like a good editor, he said, well, why don't you? And so I had this assignment to write an article about this animal issue. So I looked into it, learned that there was this burgeoning animal liberation movement, went to the library and I found Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation. I read that cover to cover, really just digested it almost overnight. You know, I just kept flipping pages and it was all so stunning to me. And I learned that there were animal experimenters on my campus. So I went and I interviewed one of them. I learned that there was an animal rights organization in my hometown of Windsor, Ontario. So I went to their meetings and I wrote this article. But it was much more than an article at that point, because particularly when I read Peter Singer's book, the way that I saw the world, you know, thinking about the haves and the have-nots, thinking about the oppressed and the oppressors, I saw that the animal issue fit into that larger way of seeing the world. And I knew that animal rights, animal liberation was a social justice issue, just as these other human-focused issues were social justice issues. So I wrote the article. Very soon after that, I organized a rally on my campus to raise awareness of animal rights issues. I started attending the local groups' meetings regularly and learned a lot there. Now, this was all around 1984. It took a while, you know, and then I started thinking about veganism, in particular because I started getting literature from groups like PETA. And PETA was the group that was sending me information on how I could have a literature table, how I could write a news release, how I could do all of these things, organize a protest, speak with the media. It really was a fast track to becoming an activist. And through PETA's literature, I learned about the abuses in the meat, dairy, and eggs industries, but I was a little bit slow making the changes. And finally, it was around 1989, after I read John Robbins' Diet for a New America, that I decided that I could no longer support these industries that harmed animals, you know, basically from cradle to grave. Like every moment of those animals' lives was unmitigated misery, and then they had a violent death. And I just could not support that anymore.
My name is Michael Budke. I am one of the founders and the executive director of Stop Animal Exploitation Now. We pronounce the acronym SANE. My background and my first involvement in animal rights came in 1986, but the road that I took to get there is different from many people. Through my education, I was obtaining a degree in animal health technology, which essentially makes you the veterinary equivalent of a registered nurse. What I didn't know when I enrolled in that program is that it was run by the veterinarians and held within the classes were held within the research facility of the University of Cincinnati. So I was exposed much more than I ever wanted to be, directly exposed to animal experimentation. In fact, I was taught how to do it. That very much drove home to me that these animals were just considered objects by this institution. As I was there to complete the program, on any given day walking down the hallway, you would be exposed to things that were just simply nightmarish. I remember looking into the wrong procedure room and seeing a rat guillotined, beheaded. And so I realized that I could not only not be a part of this, but I also had to do something about it. The first action I took for animal rights came when a pure white dog came in. This was a dog that looked like a Samoyed, eyes like a baby seal, came into the acute area to be used in animal experimentation. I first saw this dog on a Friday and something kind of snapped in me. And so what I did was I waited until the end of the day, clipped a leash on the dog and walked him out the front door, and he was never used in experimentation. After I graduated, completed the program and graduated, I became involved in a local animal rights organization. In fact, my entire family became involved in that organization. We found we needed to make a choice because it seemed to be extremely inconsistent opposing animal research and picketing the University of Cincinnati for performing animal research, and then to be going home and eating animals for dinner. And so my wife Karen and I chose to become vegan in 1986 strictly as a matter of ethical consistency. It had nothing to do with health or really even the environment. We just felt very strongly that we had to be consistent.
My name is Mary Finelli. I'm founder and director of Fish Feel, the first organization promoting respect and compassion for fishes as sentient beings. I've always been concerned for animals, always had a great love of them and wanted to help them however I best could. When I was a teenager, I read Diet for a Small Planet, which was an incentive to go vegetarian. First, however, having bought into the cultural brainwashing about protein deficiency and that fishes are not as sentient as other beings, I went pescatarian, as I explained in the book, Vegan Voices. I did soon after go vegetarian though, and shortly after that, in 1986, I moved down to Washington, D.C. and volunteered with PETA for the summer. And then I worked for PETA, and then I worked for Farm, and then I worked for the National Alliance for Animal Legislation. Then I went back to school and got my degree in animal science. 7 years through the 1990s, I worked in the farm animal section of Humane Society of the U.S. And then in the early 2000s, I worked about 7 years producing Farmed Animal Watch, an online news digest of farmed animal issues that was initiated by Animal Place and sponsored by numerous animal protection organizations. And it was around that time also that, in the early 2000s, I co-wrote a chapter in the book In Defense of Animals, The Second Wave, with Jim Mason, which is a book edited by Peter Singer. And that touched on fish issues, which is what really kind of, I believe, sparked my interest in fish issues. Because there was so little attention being paid to fishes at that point within the animal protection movement, PETA had done some work for advocacy for fishes. They actually came out with Fish Amnesty Day in 1997 to promote respect for fishes. And Mercy for Animals did a catfish slaughter plant investigation in 2011, I believe. But there was really so little attention to these animals, even though they were by far the greatest number of abused animals and they were receiving the least protection or the least attention. So in 2013, we started the organization Fish Feel. We started as a small all-volunteer organization, and in order to amplify our impact, we thought the best thing we could do is to try to get other activists and other animal protection organizations to increase or initiate their advocacy for fishes. So we made the most of social media, and we tabled at events and we spoke at conferences to increase interest and concern for fishes.
My name is Martin Rowe, and I'm currently the Executive Director of the Culture and Animals Foundation. As of 2025, I've been involved with animal advocacy for 32, 3, 4 years, depending on when you estimate that I became a vegetarian. I came to the United States in 1991 in order to pursue a master's degree in religious studies and then move into publishing. I started work at the New York Open Center and read some fascinating books on vegetarianism, including the recently published The Sexual Politics of Meat by Carol J. Adams. My master's degree thesis was on theology and vegetarianism. And I moved in with my partner, Mia MacDonald, who was instrumental in making me interested in vegetarianism. into the same apartment in 1993 when we became vegans. So that really began my journey in animal advocacy, because the next year, with a fellow graduate of the religious studies program at NYU, Beth Gould, I co-founded a magazine called Satya, which was a magazine of vegetarianism, environmentalism, animal advocacy, and social justice. It was a monthly free magazine that was dropped at health food stores and learning centers around New York. It then migrated, as everything eventually does, online. And I was there for 6 years while simultaneously working at the publishing company Continuum, which published the work of Carol Adams and people like Andrew Lindsay. So I was getting very immersed in vegetarian publishing. In 1999, I left Continuum and stopped work at Satya in order to found my own publishing company, Lantern Books, which published over the course of 20 years, 150 works on veganism and animal advocacy. And then in 2019, my co-founder and I, Jean Goligly, we went our separate ways, perfectly amicably, and I turned with another co-founder, Brian Normile, Lantern Books into a non-profit publishing company called Lantern Publishing and Media, which continues to this day. I stayed at Lantern Publishing and Media until February 2022, when I took up my current position as Executive Director of the Culture and Animals Foundation.
Thank you for watching Episode 1 of 5 Decades, 1 Mission, where we noted the significance of 1975 in the history of the U.S. animal rights movement and invited our 10 presenters to introduce themselves. We now invite you to watch Episode 2, where we cover the background and impact of animal liberation and the World Vegetarian Congress. We welcome your comments on the 5 Decades, 1 Mission video series. Please email us at info@farmusa.org.